about sarcopenia and protein distribution. Sorry, and protein supplementation. So as I'm sure most people in this room know, sarcopenia is a muscle disease, and it's rooted in adverse muscle changes that accrue across the lifespan. So it's particularly prevalent among older adults. And sarcopenia has really become quite a hot topic over recent years, not only because we have a rapidly aging population, meaning that the number of people with sarcopenia is due to rise exponentially, but also because we now know that sarcopenia is an independent risk factor for numerous negative outcomes in older adults, such as falls, physical disability, and reduced quality of life. So it's really critical that we find ways to both prevent and treat sarcopenia. Now, the etiology of sarcopenia is complex, and it likely involves multiple overlapping and interdependent factors. But areas that are particularly interesting are the contributions of poor nutrition and physical inactivity. And that's because these represent modifiable risk factors. And really today, the cornerstones for prevention and treatment of sarcopenia are exercise and nutrition interventions. So when it comes to nutrition and sarcopenia, there are a number of different nutritional components that might be of relevance. However, today I'm just going to focus on dietary protein, which is by far the most well-researched when it comes to sarcopenia. So the recommended daily allowance for dietary protein is set by the Institute of Medicine at 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day. So this value essentially represents the amount of protein required to cover daily protein losses and prevent deficiency in 97.5% of the population. And importantly, this recommended daily allowance, or RDA, is recommended for all healthy adults regardless of their age. However, it's been argued by many researchers that the amount of protein required to prevent deficiency in a predominantly young population, because this value comes from studies that were conducted predominantly in young adults, that value is unlikely to represent the optimal protein intake for older adults who are aiming to preserve muscle mass and function. So we need to stop focusing on protein levels to avoid deficiency, but rather start to think about optimizing protein intake for older adults. And in fact, there is accumulating evidence to suggest that protein intake above the RDA may be beneficial for this population. So a theory or a basis for why older adults may require more protein than the RDA comes when we consider the importance of dietary protein as a regulator of our skeletal muscle mass. And that is through its impact on muscle protein turnover. So our muscles are constantly being turned over through the processes of muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And it's really the balance between these two processes that determines whether our muscle mass increases, decreases, or remains stable over time. And in aging, there is an impairment in the muscle protein synthesis arm, specifically in response to anabolic stimuli, like exercise and dietary protein. So when we eat a meal that contains dietary protein, this will trigger a temporary rise in our rate of muscle protein synthesis that lasts a couple of hours. And there is a dose-response relationship between the amount of protein we eat in the meal and the subsequent muscle protein synthesis response. So I'll explain a little bit better with this graph what I mean by that. So if we first look at the younger individuals, they're shown by this dotted line. You can see that as the amount of protein, which is on the x-axis, as that increases in the meal, there's a graded rise in the rate of muscle protein synthesis, up to a maximally effective dose of protein of about 20 grams per meal in a younger person. So that means that a younger person can eat double the amount of protein in the meal, 40 grams, let's say, and there won't be any further increase in the rate of muscle protein synthesis. Now, the situation is a bit different in older adults, and on this graph, they're shown by the solid line. So you can see at lower protein doses, so around 10 to 20 grams of protein per meal, rates of muscle protein synthesis are suppressed in older adults. And this phenomenon is termed anabolic resistance and is now well established as a key mechanism underpinning sarcopenic muscle loss. Now, it does appear that older adults can overcome this anabolic resistance to protein feeding if they consume a very large serving of protein within the meal. So somewhere in the range of about 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal. And really this forms the basis for recommendations that older adults may require more protein than their younger counterparts to preserve muscle mass with age. And in support of this, these are the findings of a recent randomized control trial in which older men were randomly allocated to either a diet providing the RDA for protein, so 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram per day, or to a diet providing twice the RDA for protein, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram per day. And it was a really well-controlled study. The investigators provided all the food for a 10-week intervention period. And what they found, and what you're looking at here, is that in the group that received the RDA, or the diet that provided the RDA for protein, there was a decrease in appendicular lean mass, so the lean mass in the arms and legs, over the course of the 10-week diet, whereas that lean mass, or appendicular lean mass, was maintained in the group that received twice the RDA for protein. And in addition, in the group that got twice the RDA for protein, there was an increase in knee extension peak power relative to the group that got the RDA for protein. So that suggests that the RDA for protein may be insufficient for older adults for muscle mass maintenance. And there's also some observational data to support that older adults require more protein than the RDA to preserve muscle mass. Not all studies support this link, but this particular study that I'm showing here does. And this is based on the Health ABC cohort in the US. This study included over 2,000 older men and women who were well functioning at baseline. They had their lean body mass assessed with a DEXA, and their dietary intake was measured. They then sent them off for 3 years, and 3 years later, they followed them up with another DEXA. And what they found was that the older adults who were in the highest quintile for protein intake, so the top fifth in terms of protein intake, they're on your right there, the far right, and they were consuming median protein intakes of 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And they lost 40% less lean body mass over the 3 years of follow-up compared to your far left here, the older adults in the lowest quintile for protein intake, who are consuming median protein intakes of 0.7 grams of protein per kilogram per day. Sorry. So based on the totality of evidence, a number of expert working groups have made recommendations for higher protein intakes in older adults above the RDA. And this is specifically for the preservation of muscle mass and potentially strength. So they've recommended between 1 and 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day in healthy older adults, with even higher protein intake recommendations in those with acute or chronic illness or who are malnourished. So given that protein needs are higher in older adults, it follows that increasing protein intake via protein supplementation could be an effective means of slowing the loss of muscle mass and function with age. So to investigate this, a meta-analysis was performed and published in 2017. We've heard very nicely what meta-analyses are earlier. In this particular meta-analysis, they pooled all of the double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials that have investigated the impact of protein supplementation on muscle outcomes in older adults. And they were specifically interested, firstly, in studies that used isolated protein supplements or isolated amino acid supplements. So they didn't include studies that had other nutrients in the supplements, like vitamin D, for example. And secondly, they were specifically interested in studies that provided the protein supplementation in the absence of exercise training. So there was no concurrent training. And they identified 8 different randomized control trials. And what you're looking at here is a forest plot showing the impact of protein supplementation on lean body mass, a major component of which is muscle. And just to draw your attention to the summary estimate down the bottom here, you can see that that is on the vertical line of no effect. So essentially this shows that there was no statistically significant impact of protein supplementation on lean body mass in older adults relative to the placebo. They also found similar results for strength, no impact of protein supplementation on lower body strength or on hand grip strength when they combined all the studies together. And so this essentially shows that at least in the absence of exercise training, there is no good evidence to suggest that protein supplementation among older adults helps to preserve muscle mass or muscle function or strength. And now one thing to point out about these studies is that of the 8 studies included in the meta-analysis, only 5 of them actually measured the protein intake of participants at the beginning of the study. And of the 5 studies that did measure it, they found that on average protein intake was pretty good in these participants before they even started the protein supplementation. It was about 1 gram of protein per kilogram per day. So it's possible that the additional protein from the supplementation was not effective because protein intake was already adequate. So it's possible that if participants were low protein consumers at baseline, consuming either protein at the level of the RDA or even below, that protein supplementation may have been effective. And in fact, there is an ongoing trial called the PROMISE study that is investigating just this. So this is a multi-center trial between the Netherlands and Finland. They're currently recruiting 264 older men and women who are low protein consumers, so consuming less than 1 gram of protein per kilogram per day. And they're going to divide them into a protein supplemented and a placebo supplemented group and measure a range of muscle outcomes. So hopefully we'll have an answer on this in the next year or two. Another important point is that the potential beneficial effects of a higher protein intake may be further enhanced if combined with exercise training, and in particular, resistance exercise training. And the reason for this is that resistance exercise actually sensitizes our skeletal muscle to protein feeding. So what that means is that when we do a session of resistance exercise and then consume a meal that contains dietary protein, we will get a greater muscle protein synthesis response than if we ate the exact same meal but without prior exercise. And this sensitizing effect of resistance exercise is really quite long lasting, up to at least 24 hours after the exercise bout. So what that means is that if we perform a session of exercise, we're not only enhancing our muscle protein synthesis response to the immediate post-exercise meal, but to every meal we consume over the following 24 hours. So a number of studies have examined whether providing a protein supplement alongside resistance training can further enhance the gains in muscle mass and strength with the exercise training. And some, but not all, have found a benefit of the additional protein supplementation. And this is one example. This was a study conducted in 62 frail and pre-frail older men and women. They all underwent 24 weeks of resistance training twice a week. Half of them were allocated to consume protein supplements twice a day, and half of them were allocated to a placebo. Now, after the 24 weeks, both groups got equivalent gains in strength and physical performance. However, it was only, and that's what you can see here on this slide, it was only the protein group shown by the black bar that had an increase in lean body mass in response to the training, whereas that was not seen in the placebo group. So that would suggest that the additional protein during the training may have further enhanced at least some of the adaptations to the exercise training in these participants. And I'm not going to go through this study, but what I just want to point out is we can supplement or increase protein in the diet, of course, through isolated protein supplements, drinks or powders, but we can also do it perhaps preferably through increased intake of protein-rich foods. And this is an example of a study in which older women who were supplemented with extra protein-rich food in the form of red meat had greater gains in strength and lean body mass compared to a group who did the same training but without the additional red meat consumption. So the last kind of point or part of the presentation that I want to move on to is to just talk a little bit about how we could enhance the ability of low protein doses to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and preserve muscle mass. So one of the issues with protein supplementation in older adults, or asking older adults to increase their intake of protein-rich foods, is that really they need to eat quite a large amount of protein at one meal in order to maximize the muscle protein synthesis response. So I showed you this graph before, which shows that in older adults, they need to eat between 30 and 40 grams of protein per meal to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. To put that in context for you, it's equivalent to the amount of protein in about 5 eggs, a pint and a half of milk, 3 to 4 ounces of meat. So really quite a large serving to consume at each meal of the day. So there's been a lot of interest in how we could take smaller doses of protein that are more manageable, particularly for older adults with poor appetite or chewing or swallowing difficulties, and how we could enhance the ability of these lower protein doses to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And one candidate here is leucine. Leucine is an essential amino acid that has a really special and unique role as a trigger for muscle protein synthesis. And there are now a number of studies that have shown that if you take a suboptimal low dose of protein and essentially spike it with extra leucine, then that will result in a greater muscle protein synthesis response in older adults compared to the low dose of protein alone. And of course, it doesn't increase the volume that they have to consume very much. And so in a study that I did during my time in McMaster University in Canada, where I did my PhD, we were interested in whether we could kind of take this a step further, and could we give older adults just a little shot of leucine to take alongside their normal daily meals, and could that increase rates of muscle protein synthesis in older men? And we wanted to know whether this would be effective in a rested condition and also when we combined it with resistance exercise. And in addition, we were interested in whether this leucine supplementation strategy could be effective in those consuming a lower protein diet in line with the RDA, but also in those consuming a higher protein intake that is more in line with the recent recommendations from the expert working groups for optimal protein intake. So this is what we found, and I know this is an extremely busy slide, so I'm just going to talk you through it nice and slowly. So first, if we take the rested or non-exercised condition, what we found, and that's shown by the patterned bars, is that when the older men had the leucine supplement alongside their normal meals, there was an increased rate of muscle protein synthesis compared to when they consumed the exact same meals. We controlled all of that, but with a placebo. And the white and the blue boxes just show the higher protein and lower protein diet groups. And essentially the take home there is that there was no difference. It didn't matter whether they were consuming a higher protein diet or a lower protein diet. The leucine was equally effective for boosting muscle protein synthesis. Now looking over to the resistance exercise condition, as expected, across the board, rates of muscle protein synthesis were higher when the older men performed resistance exercise compared to in the rested condition. However, what was very interesting was that when they performed or when they consumed the leucine alongside their meals, this further raised rates of muscle protein synthesis in the resistance exercise condition relative to the placebo. So there was an additive benefit of the leucine on top of the resistance exercise in terms of muscle protein synthesis. So what we can take from these data are that leucine supplementation may hold promise as a potential strategy to slow the loss of muscle mass and potentially strength with age. And so there have been a handful of long-term studies that have examined whether protein supplementation with added leucine could have beneficial effects on muscle outcomes in older adults. And this is one example, and this is the PROVIDE study. This was a multi-center, double-blind, randomized control trial conducted in 380 sarcopenic older men and women. So that's a really big sample size for this kind of a study, and it's one of the few studies that have actually been conducted looking at the impact of nutrition specifically in sarcopenic individuals. And so that's one of the reasons I think it's quite a good one. So what they did in this study is they randomly allocated people to get a drink that contained leucine and vitamin D enriched whey protein twice a day, or an isocaloric energy matched placebo. And after 13 weeks, they measured changes in a range of different muscle outcomes. And what you can see on the graph here is that with the black bar that shows the leucine enriched protein group, they had a greater gain in appendicular lean mass compared to the control group. In addition, they had a greater improvement in chair stand test time and a small but significant improvement in bone mineral density. So this is a particularly interesting study because it's one of the first to show as a proof of principle that specific nutrient supplementation in the absence of exercise training can have beneficial effects on muscle outcomes in older adults. So I think it'll be very interesting to see future studies come out using this kind of a supplement and to see if they corroborate the findings of the PROVIDE study. So just to leave you with some take-home points today. The first, and we'll hear about this in the next couple of presentations, is resistance training is the most effective strategy to prevent and treat sarcopenia. However, nutrition can support this. And without a doubt, adequate protein intake is essential for the maintenance of muscle mass and muscle quality. Increased protein intake, either through protein supplementation or through increased intake of protein-rich foods, may add to the benefits of exercise training in terms of muscle gains in muscle mass and strength. However, based on the current literature, there is no good evidence to suggest that protein supplementation alone, in the absence of exercise, can improve muscle mass and strength outcomes in older adults. Inconsistencies in these studies may relate to the fact that most studies haven't selected individuals with inadequate protein intake in order to put them on one of these protein supplementation studies. So the PROMISE trial, which is ongoing, will hopefully fill in a few of these gaps for us. And finally, there's some interesting emerging evidence surrounding the role of leucine and vitamin D enriched protein supplementation. This may be more effective than pure protein supplementation, so it'll be interesting to see what future studies show. So while we wait for this additional data to come down the line, what can we do today in the clinic? Well, the first thing we can do is encourage physical activity. It's a common theme today, especially resistance training in collaboration with the physiotherapist. Secondly, we can assess what the patient is actually eating, and obviously dietitians are trained to do this. Adequate energy intake is paramount. When it comes to protein targets, the optimal protein intake is really hotly debated in the sarcopenia literature, but somewhere in the range of 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day would be in line with the existing evidence. If the patient is not meeting this protein target, the first line should be to try and encourage them to increase their protein intake through greater intake of protein-rich foods, in particular high quality protein and those that are high in leucine content. For example, the dairy proteins are particularly enriched in leucine. And finally, failing that, if the patient is unable to increase their intake of protein through food alone, then protein supplementation may be warranted, but ideally this would be combined with exercise training. And so this is just one last quote to leave you with, and that I think quite nicely summarizes best practice when it comes to sarcopenia. That is, exercise is king, nutrition is queen, put them together and you've got a kingdom. And that's Jack LaLanne. So thank you very much.